It's Jason Walker coming to you from Mind Body Green, the Mind Body Green podcast with Dr. Aviva Romm, who's got an amazing new book out, which everyone has to pick up. And we're going to talk more about the adrenal thyroid revolution. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So we're gonna go back in time to Queens and the projects where I don't think a lot of people know that that's where, you live in Western Mass and you spend time in New York, but you grew up in the projects in Queens.
I sure enough did, actually.
And so talk to me about that.
So I grew up, I was born in 66. My mom and dad my mom was the first one in our family to go to college as a woman. I was the first one in my family to graduate from college as a woman. My mom and dad were college sweethearts at Queens College. And at some point, a lot of public housing went up in New York
Sure.
to provide more affordable housing. I don't think it was the vision that it was going to become sort of the project.
Right.
It was
Like
just
Robert
subsidized.
Moses, like
It was just subsidized, wonderful housing. And my parents took an apartment across the street from Queens College, where I was not born at home, but
sure.
I was actually born in Harlem. And at a hospital that's no longer there. It burned down, Flower and Fifth Hospital, but it was kind of a New York institution.
Right.
And grew up in this really, in many ways, great neighborhood because
Which neighborhood?
it's called Pominock Housing Projects. It's
Okay.
still there. Now, when you search it online, I think the first thing you come up with is a shooting in a 4-person shooting.
Oh, God.
Yeah. But and when I was a kid, I mean, you had to be aware, and it was
Sure.
definitely not like growing up in the suburbs or Westchester.
Right.
But it was a community at the same time. It was very multicultural. There were kids from all over. One of my close family friends was a family of 5 kids that lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. They were from Mexico.
Wow.
There were Russian immigrants and, just African American, everybody.
Melting pot.
It was a total melting pot. And as kids, we didn't get that there were any kind of cultural issues that kept us apart. We all played together, hung out together. Our school was in our neighborhood. And so you were aware of, kind of tensions and drugs and
Sure.
violence, but it wasn't what kind of pervaded our life as kids. It was really just everybody watched out for everybody. There was we used to call her Fat Minnie because she was really, really this gigantic woman who always sat on the front porch. You can't stop throwing the ball at the wall. 'Cause we're always playing handball against the wall.
Sure.
It was just like that. But at the same time, I grew up with a single mom in late 1960s, early 1970s. There weren't a lot of single moms. She was working 2 jobs. I shared a teeny tiny bedroom with my brother. We had bunk beds. I was in a bunk bed with my brother till I was 14 in our 2-bedroom
How
apartment.
many years apart were you?
4 years apart.
4 years.
Yeah. And, there were tough aspects of it. I was always a really kind of verbal, academically gifted kind of kid. And I was bullied at some point starting around 3rd, 4th grade because I did really well in my classes and there were kids who didn't and the teachers really favored me. So there was like pretty serious bullying. In fact, I just saw the movie Moonlight.
Sure. A phenomenal movie.
It
Yeah.
was one of the most powerful
So sad and heartwarming and
it was
everything.
amazing. But when I walked out of the movie theater, I started crying because there was that moment where he was in the school and he couldn't leave because someone had passed him a note that said, "We're going to get you out of school." And that happened to me. Like that actual scenario happened to me in 3rd or 4th grade. But then on the other hand, there were the amazing kids in my school who I could say, "I got this note," and they're like, "We're going to walk you home." And there would be like a gang of kids surrounding
It's like
me.
threatening. Wow.
Oh yeah. It was like classic bullying. And then it was a lot of economic hardship. I think that because we were all economically similar, even if we were culturally different, I don't think we realized much. I don't think we realized what we didn't have until a certain point in my life where my mom took me out of the community public school and put me into a private school where we got a scholarship and I went. And all of a sudden I was around really, really wealthy
When
kids.
was that?
That was 6th grade.
Got it.
So I
Where
left.
did you go?
I went to a little private Hebrew day school
Okay.
in a different part of Flushing. So I was taking 2 buses and getting myself there. And that was a really different experience. But I think part of what happened for me was this great sense of community. And, I think when you grow up in New York as a kid, you kind of grow up confident
Sure. And aware.
Yeah, super aware of your surroundings. You have like a kind of confidence in your own sixth sense. You get really good at reading people, like really great life skills that I think make New Yorkers able to communicate with people pretty much anywhere and feel really comfortable anywhere. But at the same time, growing up in what I eventually realized was economically limited surroundings and also being very academically and verbally gifted. I was, every year winning my school science fair, my school spelling bee, the um, like borough or borough community spelling bee, et cetera, et cetera. I learned a few powerful things, but things that eventually I realized may not serve me anymore, which is that ability to read what people wanted so I could get what I needed in a situation or stay safe in a situation. And also that achieving at a really high level kept me safe and got me out of there. So achieving at a really high level became a huge goal. And ultimately it was great. I got into Bronx Science, which if you're from New York,
Sure, huge deal.
it's a huge deal. It's one of these schools where, even Nobel laureates still put Bronx Science on their CV. But I was commuting from Queens. It was a 2.5-hour commute each way. I was on the debate team. Yeah, I got up really early and it was a crazy year. I gained 40 pounds that year eating Dunkin' Donuts for breakfast. And
Thyroid.
yeah, I mean, my thyroid thankfully stayed fine, knock wood, everything stayed intact. But I think what happened for me was that for whatever reason, I think we all have our own sort of level of resilience and grit and our way of responding to stress. And some people's way of responding to stress is to shrink in the face of stress or to get depressed. Mine is I like have a little bit of fighting spirit. So I saw what was happening. Things were getting increasingly stressful for me and my mom at home. The commute was really stressful and I wasn't happy and I was gaining weight and not feeling well. And I actually wrote a letter to Johns Hopkins University and said, I was 14, would you take me early admission to the med school? Not even to the college, but to the med school. And they wrote me a letter and said, you're a little young, but there is a school if you want to apply for sort of gifted kids where you skip high school and you start college. And so I secretly applied, got an interview, got my grandfather to take me to the interview, got accepted, got a scholarship. It's called Simon's Rock and it's part of Bard College. So I left New York at 15 and went to college. And it was amazing. I got out of the housing project and that year was transformative for me. I mean, I went from like this inner city kid in 1 year to this dreadlock vegan hippie studying herbal medicine.
So it seems like you have an opportunity for science. Like this is the 70s, I'm assuming, early 80s. Like you're also a woman.
Yeah.
Like talk to me about that. Like I think
Yeah, it was a really interesting time. So, as I said, I was kind of like this spelling bee science fair kind of kid.
traditionally very male.
Yeah, and it was really interesting. So, just a quick backstory. My mom was kind of progressive and, open-minded, feminist. And when I was 6 years old, I was in Canada on a trip with my mom, and I saw a sign on a post and it said, "Come to a gay party." And I was like, "Mom, that sounds," actually, I think I was 4. And I was like, "Mom, that sounds really fun. Can we go?" And she said, "Oh, well, that's not the kind of gay it means," because I thought it meant come to a happy party. And she tried to explain what it meant. And then, as if on cue, like 2 minutes later, we were walking up the street and there was this, I remember it, those old kind of old fashioned shoe stores where there's like the glass cases and then the alcove. And there were 2 men just making out. And there, she's like, "That's the kind of gay party it is." And I was like, "Oh, well, that's really cool." So, flash forward, I don't know what possessed me, but so, I had in sixth grade, I had actually come in third in the New York City Science Fair, which is huge. If you can imagine how many kids are in the New York City Science Fair. Seventh grade, I decided to do a project on whether being gay. And now remember, this is like 1978. Whether being gay was nurture or nature, was it biology? Because at that point, it was considered basically a mental disorder. And I didn't think it was based on what I saw when I was 4 or 6. I don't know why I picked that. I got kicked out of the New York City. I got kicked out of my school science fair, and I was told that that was an inappropriate project. So, now that would be a lawsuit, right? It'd be a discrimination lawsuit. Back then, I kind of put up a fight. I thought that was really unfair. So I don't know that being a woman ever kind of stopped me from just sort of like speaking up. And I never really let, for me, that be an obstacle.
Sure.
And it's interesting, like right now, I run some online women's programs training women health professionals in integrative alternative functional medicine, whatever you want to call it. And I keep them as women-only programs, and the reason is I don't want women to feel limited by what dynamics often come up when women and men are in the same group, and I was kind of taught not to let that dynamic get in my way. So the things that women do when we're in groups with men tend to be like that upending of the voice at the end of a sentence. So instead of making a statement, we ask a question. So it'd be like, "Do you know what I mean?"
Sure.
Or even if it's an actual statement, it still upends into a question mark, or letting ourselves get spoken over, or just the competition that comes up or the insecurities that come up. So for me as a woman, I don't know that it may have been impacting me more than I realized, but I kind of
Just plowed through.
I did. And I think that's where the New York spirit comes in, and sort of that housing project kind of
Right.
grit a little bit comes in. I didn't, and I'm not, I think because I was bullied also, I'm not one to suffer bullying at all. So when I see a certain kind of injustice, I tend to not be super quiet
Right.
about it. Yeah. So I'm not sure that had such a huge impact on me but it does. I mean, it does have an impact. I see it in so many ways in science. I mean, even now, only 40% of all science leadership positions or medical leadership positions are women. I definitely saw it happening in medical school and residency. And I still see it even, I think there's a lot of philosophical male dominance, even in the integrative functional medicine world,
Sure.
at play.
And so you're 15.
Yeah, I was
You're in
15.
college.
Yep.
That you're in this program, and then talk about it. You become a midwife.
Yeah. So
So that's
I,
like most girls. It's like, oh, I'm gonna get out of the projects and become a midwife. Usually,
yeah.
that's not the.
No, not the usual trajectory. I think most girls just don't get out, unfortunately. And for me, I had this amazing opportunity and was gung ho. I was going to go to medical school, and I had this whole sort of New York life plan.
John Hopkins, by the way.
I so wish I did. I mean, the fact that whoever that person
But
was,
like it's confident, like a little thing. It's like someone wrote back to you, and I'm sure as a kid you see that. It's like, oh my God, I can do this.
exactly. And it's funny because my husband he works with me and he kind of runs the back end of the business. And he's always like, Aviva, you should really hire someone to answer your emails. You should really hire someone to do your Facebook page. And I'm like, that's what I do myself. I can hire people to do tech stuff. I can hire, but the human stuff.
Right.
And I actually, now that you're saying it, wonder if it wasn't sort of that very moment
Well,
that a human being bothered to answer a 14-year-old's letter.
Change your life.
It totally changed my life.
Like a little thing, like
Huge.
you'd probably give it, to be a
Yeah.
wall.
If you're out there and you
Someone
really
just answer it. Oh, don't answer it, and then
yeah,
boom.
exactly.
I feel like that would be a special, special on TV, like you and the person being the person
Yeah.
who wrote the letter.
It really changed my life. And there are those teachers that I can remember along the way. My kindergarten teacher, my second grade teacher,
Really?
I remember all their names. A particular PE, like a physical education teacher I had in sixth grade who just was there, like those particular people. And I think teachers are so often undervalued in the role that they play. But for me, and especially having a busy single mom working two jobs, we didn't always get along at all, actually. And having other women or men, it can be other men too, who are there to act as mentors and kind of take that personal interest is so powerful.
Tough, pretty, science achieving, very driven teenagers.
Hmm.
Like a very nurturing.
Yeah.
When I see midwife, when I think midwife, I think of like very nurturing.
Yeah.
I don't think of the overachieving,
No, it's a different.
from the projects.
Yeah, I mean, I pull that out when I need to. So, for example, I had a woman I worked with who had a really high risk, complicated previous pregnancy before coming to work with me. And so she had to have her baby in the hospital, and I was a home birth midwife. So she asked me if I would come with her. And long story short, she had a lot of medical interventions that she had to have, but didn't want to have during the pregnancy because philosophically, it wasn't who she was, getting her blood tested and ultrasounds every few weeks. But for her baby's life, she had to do that. So when it came to labor, I was in the hospital in labor with her, and this big burly obstetrician comes in. It's time for the baby to be born, and he picks up some scissors to do an episiotomy, which is cutting.
I know
the
what that is. Yeah,
baby.
we just had a baby.
Yeah. So I looked at him and I still remember his name was Dr. Green. I said, Dr. Green, look, she's been through a lot and she's done everything you want, but she really doesn't want an episiotomy. And he looked at me and he said, this is my delivery and I'll do an episiotomy if I damn well please. And that moment, like that challenge, my hand went right on her bottom. I said, well, then you're going to have to cut through me to get to her. And it was just like that moment of that there are those moments in my life where that housing project kind of grit, just like you're not effing with my patient here, my client. And he put the scissors down and actually a few weeks later he hired midwives in his practice. He actually called my client and said, let her know
Wow.
that was such a shift for me. So what happened was basically I went off to Simon's Rock all ready to do pre-med. There was no integrative medicine back then. That term did not exist. There were a few books at the like Shambhala bookstore in Boston and the crunchy places here in New York, but it wasn't like something you could go and study. You could go to China and study acupuncture, basically, and that was it. There weren't really licensed massage therapists. There was just nothing. And I met a guy who I totally fell in love with, and he was this hippie-ish guy from New York, actually, who was in my program, long hair, wore a skirt, totally alternative. And he had a book called Spiritual Midwifery. And he said, I think you would really be interested in this. And Ina May Gaskin, who actually, when I was 28, wrote the foreword to my first book. Yeah, she's amazing. And that book was just transformative for me. So I got that book, and then I got a copy of an article it was an academic article called The Perinatal Roots of War by someone named Stanislav Grof. Now, Grof is well known now for his holotropic breath work, but he was a Czechoslovakian psychiatrist who was doing early LSD research in like the 1950s and 60s, brought over here by the US government for essentially like the mind control kind of
Like
studies.
Timothy Leary type of.
Yeah, I mean, kind of a little bit preceding him in his research, but they became contemporaries. And Grof wrote a paper called The Perinatal Roots of War, which was about how essentially we kind of spend our lives recapitulating our experience of birth, kind of seeking resolution. And it's a little bit simplistic when I think about it now, but there are some real truths in it. And for me as a 15-year-old, becoming very politically aware, active,
What's going on in the country around that?
rebellious, it was a really intense time because essentially we were having a nuclear arms escalation. And so I think there was a lot of fear. Like I went to the first, that big peace rally that
Sure.
in
This is like early 80s.
August, like 81.
Yeah.
And so there was I think a sense of a lot of instability in the world, right? We could all
Yeah,
kind of just
history repeats itself.
yeah, it's really it's a different time. And I talked to my daughters about that, like, try and explain to them this is not the first time we've all been terrified and we're still here and, thankfully. But I think at that time, for me, I was becoming very aware of the connection between how we eat and what we eat and the sort of military industrial complex and how there were some of the same companies that were making cancer causing environmental chemicals that were producing pharmaceuticals for anti-cancer drugs. And there's a lot of political foment for me happening around food and medicine and politics and the intersection of that. And then I started listening to reggae and smoking weed, and I grew dreads and became very political, not obnoxiously. Like I've never been a real judgmental person or kind of holier than thou, but my path really got set as this is something I can do to contribute to the world in my own way, right? We can become more independent of the military industrial complex. We don't have to take pharmaceuticals for everything. We don't have to, eat food that is poisoning ourselves and the planet. And everything for me was an intersection at that time between this sort of inseparability between personal health and global health.
And you're still in your teens at this
I was
point.
15.
So this is like pretty heavy stuff for like
It was.
a 15-year-old. Like,
It was amazing. And, I think about my life and I'm thinking, wow, I'm so grateful. I mean, that I had that so early on, because also for me, the last time I took a pharmaceutical until a couple of years ago was when I was 15. I went 35 years with no Tylenol, no ibuprofen, no antibiotics, nothing. And it's not that I wouldn't if I didn't need it, but it was really this, how can we explore alternatives? And at the same time, it seemed like we could potentially just sort of blow ourselves up And so I also became kind of back to the landish, right? So I learned how to make fire by friction and
Wow.
skin animals and make my own moccasins and grow my own food and make my own at that back
So
in the day.
geographically, where is this place?
I was in Western Massachusetts,
Got it.
actually.
Okay.
Yeah. And then my husband and I met my husband around the same time. We got together a few years later, but we ultimately moved to Vermont
Got it.
and we're living there for a while.
So let's get back to the midwife. So
Yeah.
when do you decide, like, I want to be a midwife? And then do you just like jump in? I want to meet this woman. Do you write her a letter and she says, come to work with me?
So actually what happened was I got this book and then I finished my first year at Simon's Rock. So I finished my first year of college, 15 to 16, and I moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts for the summer. And then my life really even kind of shifted even more. Had my first really serious boyfriend whose dad was the most famous living philosopher in the world.
Share who it is.
Yeah, Joshua Putnam was my boyfriend. His dad was Hilary Putnam, who just passed away last year. He's considered the most influential philosopher since Aristotle.
Wow.
And Josh's mom was a philosopher also, and also her parents, her mother started another Mother for Peace. Her parents were like a long backstory. She escaped from Nazi Germany when she was a young girl.
What did Josh end up becoming? That's a lot to live
A
up to.
hippie for a long time,
Okay.
and then he's a tech guy, and
Okay.
that's a whole other story. But yeah,
Come back for that.
super interesting family who really took me in a lot of ways, and they had been very involved in sort of the 60s and 70s in Harvard, communist movement, student rights, and so it was a very high level of conversation about philosophy and politics and religion, and they were very supportive. And I, at that same time, met my first midwife, who interestingly now 35 years later just became a student in my women's herbal program, which was such an honor. But she is a incredibly powerful African American woman who was a home birth midwife, largely in the Black Rasta Muslim community in Roxbury, Massachusetts, who took me on and said, I will train you. And so I worked with Shafia for about a year doing I wasn't going to births with her at that time. I was just going to prenatal visits with her, doing childbirth education training and kind of learning.
So what was interesting to you about the practice? Was it just,
I mean, everything,
right.
really everything. I mean, this was a woman who would ride on the back of the buses in Roxbury and talk to teenage girls about, she'd say, kind of like, I don't know how bold I can be on your.
Should be as bold as you want.
And she'd say to girls at the back of the bus, do you have anything crawling around in your coochie? And they'd be like, who are you? And she's like, well, they'd be like, we don't look down there. Like, well, she'd be like, do you let guys do things down there?
Right.
She was so empowering for women. And so I feel like for me, it was really, it was exposure to a whole other culture of women who were taking back their health. And that was so powerful for me. And I think, ultimately, I did a lot of my midwifery studies in the African American community. And I think there's a lineage and a heritage of women taking care of each other in a way that I didn't experience before.
Right.
Really powerful tribe. And that was an incredibly just beautiful part of my life. And then also a deeper exposure to some spiritual tradition that was powerful for me around ritual and femininity and really loving ourselves for who we are in a really powerful way. So it was an education on so many
and herbs play a role here too.
At that point, for me, the herbs were a lot about an extension of food, right? It's just sort of like food. I jokingly now say herbs are sort of food 2.0 because they really are. They're plants, but they just have a kind of a more concentrated, contracted chemical constituent profile that do things.
Can you say that again?
Yes. Can I say that again? Contracted chemical constituent profile.
That's a good one.
Concentrated in that, we know that things like blueberries are good for our health. We know that leafy greens are good for our health, and they have phytochemicals or plant chemicals that do things in our bodies. And herbs are just an extension of that. And I really was powerfully committed to helping women and moms not be so dependent on pharmaceuticals. And at that point, right now in the US, by the time we're 18 years old, on average, we've been given 20 rounds of antibiotics. So not 20 doses, but 20 discrete courses of antibiotics. And that's improved over the 1980s.
Right.
So back then, a mom would take her kid to the pediatrician for an earache, and the pediatrician would say something quite literally like, well, if you don't give your baby the antibiotic, your child's going to go deaf or die.
Right.
And no mom is going to really take that chance if
Right.
she's not sure. At that time, there were about 3 herbal books on the market. So I had to start looking back at what were called the eclectic medical textbooks, which were the doctors in the late 1800s and early 1900s who had no pharmaceuticals and were
Right.
using herbal medicines, and really start digging and
Do you
seeing
remember
what
any of those
were doing.
names?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole series of the eclectic medical textbooks, and they're pretty easy to find
Right.
online. So tons and tons
Got it.
of John Uri Lloyd, the Lloyd brothers
Yep.
were an early pharmaceutical company that had treatises and textbooks, but even the early American pharmacopoeias. So every year we have this thing called the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, and the
Sure.
drugs that are in use at any given time. If you go back to sort of before 1930, they're pretty much
All
botanicals.
right.
Yeah. And so I was going back to those, learning what people did. And what happened was a lot of the women who were having home births naturally were more naturally inclined. And so
Sure.
for many of the same reasons they didn't want to go to the hospital back then, they didn't want to just give their kid a medication for every
Sure.
sniffle and cold and fever. So I had to sort of figure out what was available. And it was, we weren't going to go to the doctor if we really needed to. It wasn't exclusionary, but let's figure out what we can do
Sure.
first. And so I just kept seeing one thing after another, having success.
And so when in this process do you become a full-on midwife and herbalist?
So
Because you're like 16
I'm
now.
16. Yeah.
Like I was going to like keg parties at say, well, trying to get into keg parties at 16.
I kind of skipped that
You skipped the whole thing. You didn't miss much.
party thing. And that's what everybody tells me.
Yeah.
It's so funny. Everyone's like, yeah, you didn't miss much. So my teens and my 20s were sort of what a lot of people were figuring out, I guess, in their 30s and stuff. But
Yeah.
so I moved to Atlanta, where my husband is from. We met when I was 15 and he was 25.
Oh, wow.
We got together when I was 18 and he was 28, introduced by the same guy who introduced me to spiritual midwifery. And to just give some perspective, I wasn't a trust fund kid. I was making a living the whole time. So I was renting, living in, co-op apartments with collectives of friends. The same guy who showed me spiritual midwifery taught me how to do beadwork. And so I was doing beautiful beadwork. I had a little table and I was selling beadwork on the street in Harvard Square, when Harvard Square was still hippiedom, before Harvard Square had Aubon Pen and that little area in Harvard Square. And I was selling beadwork and I was doing temp childcare. And eventually I took a job working for a family doing childcare in their home.
Little did they know.
I know. And it was great. I mean, I had dreads, and here was, I was 16 now with dreads and like this very alternative life. And they trusted me, which was really great. And so that's what I did. And kind of just paid my rent and studied on the side. And I was every tahini jar, every almond butter jar, every peanut butter jar was washed, emptied out. And
was almond butter that expensive back then?
It was not. And there was no Whole Foods back then, actually, either. And I cleaned out every jar, made little handmade labels, bought little bags of herbs, put the herbs in the jars, wrote the labels. Every day I would study a few of the labels, learn the Latin names. I mean, it was really very self-study oriented thing. And nobody else that I knew anything about herbs. So I just kind of had to figure that part out on my own, which became valuable because the midwives I eventually worked with, turned to me for that information. So I really got to practice what I was doing. So then my husband and I moved. We were living in Vermont, like way out in the boondocks.
So you go from Atlanta to Vermont.
We were in Boston.
Okay.
So this whole time was Boston, Cambridge. We moved to Vermont. We were living way out in the woods. And we ended up moving to Atlanta. The house we were renting in Vermont was up for sale and it actually sold. We're like, there's 4 feet of snow on the ground. His family's from Atlanta. We thought and I met a midwife in Atlanta who wanted to full-on apprentice me. So we picked up our stuff, put it in our van, moved to Atlanta.
Wow.
And that was where I started a full-on apprenticeship, actually attending births. So I was working in a collective of midwives called Dua Afe, which means whole woman in Yiddish, and started going on births. That time I was 18. I apprenticed with them till I was 20, and they finally said, look, and I worked with another group of midwives.
So what is
also.
when you go home for holidays, like, or you talk to your mother, what's she saying? Like, what was her take on all of this?
My mom and I were so estranged, unfortunately, at that
Got it.
time. I think that, I think my sort of conversation with my mom at that time was a mixture of all kinds of things. Like, on the one hand, she was super curious about what I was doing.
Right.
I think it was really terrifying for her too. I
Sure.
mean, she had me really young. So she and my dad got pregnant the first time my mom ever had sex.
Whoa.
Yeah. And she
Oh,
had me really young. She left school.
teens, I'm assuming.
She was 19 when I was born.
Wow.
And so, or 18, like a little over 18. Or something. Wait, she's 19 and a half years older than I am.
Got it.
So she was really young. She left school. I think for her at that time, there was a real mixture. I mean, she was in so many ways a great mom and really gave
Sure.
me a lot of latitude and really supported my unusualness. And at the same time, I think she had no idea what to do with me.
Right.
And also, I think back then I think the opportunities for single women back then were a lot harder.
Sure.
And in many ways, I think I represented for her a loss of
Her own childhood, her own
life,
teen.
right?
Right.
Her potential
Right. Right.
ability to achieve what she wanted to achieve in life. So we had a very conflicted relationship
Sure.
where I think a lot of, unfortunately, her frustrations in her own life came out on me.
Sure.
But I think she tried to be supportive, and I think she was really scared that I was just repeating her mistakes.
Right.
And in some ways, I think as kids, we kind of do that, right? Like we take things either to the next level, but some stuff maybe in a family constellations way, we do repeat and then
Yes.
we take it one step forward.
Yep.
So I had my first with my husband when I was 19.
Oh,
And,
wow.
we're still together and it's been 32 years. Like,
Congratulations.
thank you. Intact most of the
Sure.
time, in family. But, I think she was really freaked out. And I just tried to really encourage her and remind her that I was just ahead of the curve.
Right.
And I had to reassure her, like, I wasn't in a cult. I mean, can you imagine in
Well,
1981?
there were also like cults back then too,
Yeah,
and like,
and so like
yeah.
coming home in 1981 saying, I'm leaving school, I'm moving into a co-op house in Boston, and I have
Right.
dreadlocks now. Like,
Right. Scary.
yeah, really scary. So she was pretty good, but I think our relationship at that point was also, I was kind of on my own financially.
Sure.
Needed to really separate myself to kind of figure out who I
Sure.
was out of that stress. And I think, almost fast forwarding to the book, I think the book for me and where and how I'm living my life now is such a full circle in that I think I learned also during that time that there were a lot of things that were driving me, like the need to be high achieving
Sure.
or impressive or just certain attributes that came out of fear and survival mode
Sure.
that really served me. But at some point, I didn't have to keep living by
Right.
anymore. Like I could thank them and say, okay, I don't have to do that anymore.
Right.
So yeah, so that's how the midwifery happened.
So you do that. So you start having children.
Yeah.
Having children. You're a midwife. You're an herbalist, and then so you're not a doctor yet.
I'm not a doctor.
So all this time passes.
Yeah.
20 something years.
Yeah.
And then you decide to go to medical school.
Yeah. So it was kind of
which is kind of a big,
it's
like
huge.
You went from like super early bloomer, like I'm 15, I'm going to college,
Yeah.
and then med school, pretty not late in life, but the non-traditional path.
It was very non-traditional. So what happened was for me, for those who are listening who don't know the politics around midwifery, when I started out midwifery in the early 80s, mid 80s, people would literally say, "You're a what?"
Right.
Or wait, we still have them?
Right.
And at that point, I was living in Atlanta, so I was, Jimmy Carter was actually born at home because he was. So I was like, and people like, oh, okay. But that was such like a backwater
Sure.
thing to do to have at home. And so it was very, kind of out there, but it was also very illegal, right?
Sure.
History of midwifery is very charged. I mean, you can go back all the way to the Middle Ages and see persecution of midwives, the persecution of women in the early years of the formation of the United States in New England was persecution of midwives and herbalists. And a lot of that attitude hadn't changed. And so I was very marginalized. In most states, midwives were illegal and midwives were being persecuted and arrested. So it was a very underground, and actually at times quite scary
Sure.
profession to be in. I actually had 4 kids. I was homeschooling. I had people in my neighborhood who I could call if I were to get arrested, who could come and get my kids so that my kids wouldn't be in the custody of the state. Because if you get arrested home with your
Sure.
kids, you're
It's scary to even have to have a plan for that.
yeah, so I actually had a plan for it, and it's just a weird way to live, but I felt very clear on what I was doing and why I was doing it, and what I saw happening in the conventional medical model and how women were being treated was not acceptable either, and women really needed an alternative. And so, a lot of us as women, kind of starting, with the sort of feminist movement, I guess, in the 60s and 70s, kind of progressed to creating a real profession of midwifery. And then at some point, there were a number of different factors, both as a midwife and an herbalist. At this point, I had written some books,
Yep.
was starting to get asked to speak at medical conferences, was having more of a name recognition, having increasingly more people contacting me for care for increasingly complex health problems because they weren't finding answers in the medical world. And at the same time, I was completely marginalized
Right.
professionally. So I felt like there were things that I wanted to learn, that I was curious about, that the answers weren't going to be found in the herbal or midwifery world because they were so left of the medical field.
Right.
And to some extent even shunned science,
Right.
shunned medicine. Like that was kind of
So this is like giving these people a voice that's legitimizing voice.
be somebody who, when women did need medical care, like all the cool people were on the outside, but if you really did need to go to the hospital, it was kind of a terrifying experience. You were really going into a very foreign land where.
And you're in your late 30s around this point?
Well, I mean,
early.
Kind of all of this.
When do you decide to go to med school?
Yeah, I mean, I really decided to go to med school probably in my late 20s, and I had little kids, and I had left high school at 9th grade to go to college, and then had left college after my first year.
Right.
So essentially had no degree. I didn't even have an SAT. I had never taken the SAT. So I'm probably the only person.
The envy of a lot of kids around the country right now.
I've still never taken the SAT. So I graduated from Yale Medical School, having never taken the SAT. So at some point, there were a kind of confluence of factors of feeling like, in order to really have a voice for people who felt underrepresented but needed medical care, I was going to need to be able to speak a certain language.
Yep.
In order to make shifts in the way the medical model treats women and moms and children, I was going to need to have not only an education in that to really speak intelligently to it, but to have a credential that spoke for itself. And there were things I really wanted to learn. I mean, there were things for me, for example, when a woman, I couldn't even use the word patient at that point. It was illegal.
Right.
A client.
Right.
But when a woman came to me, for example, pregnant and on a pharmaceutical that was potentially dangerous for pregnancy and was looking for an alternative, I didn't have the knowledge of whether she could go off that medication, how dangerous that medication was, or the authority to say to her, look, I know I'm thinking of one particular woman, for example, who had ulcerative colitis, which is an autoimmune disease, and was pregnant and was put on steroids and immunosuppressive drugs, but she was pregnant, and those were classes of drugs that were potentially dangerous. But it wasn't like I could just get on the phone with a gastroenterologist and say, look, come up with a better plan here.
He'd hang up on you. Right.
Yeah. And so, and I also got tired of being illegal.
Right.
There were also aspects of the herbal and the midwifery world that I felt like could use a little bit of, not coming out of the dark ages, because I still really totally believe in indigenous knowledge, but there was such a polarization, I think.
Sure. And not all Western is evil. Like there is science and there are exciting things happen. Exactly.
So I think at that time, I really saw myself as sort of being a bridge builder. And I sort of still see myself that way both sides. There really aren't both sides. It's a false polarity.
Yes.
How can we embrace the whole spectrum of
what
any of us needs at any given time, and at the same time never lose perspective on the unintended consequences of pharmaceuticals and interventions, both for ourselves and our environment. So I had to really put the pieces into place. I had to do my undergrad, and then I had to do my pre-meds.
And you've got how many kids?
4 kids.
4 kids at this point. Homeschooling.
Yeah.
And you're going back to college.
Going back to college.
And then You go to Yale Medical School.
Yes, I go to Yale Medical.
So you don't just, so you make that, like, these are big things. And so how old are you when you enter Yale
39.
Medical School? Wow. So you are, most people are in their 20s. You're this full-time mom, midwife, or like, what is that like when you show up at Yale Medical School when you have all these like type A, like, and they're like, who, what? Wait.
It was amazing. So I think for me, I really hand selected Yale and was just jumping up and down when I got in. I
Sure.
was so excited. And the reason I hand selected it was I found that of all the medical schools that I interviewed at and got into, in many ways, it was the most progressive. It was a New England liberal environment. And there was an incredible element of curiosity there.
Yeah.
And I think that the professors there, everybody was first name basis. I mean, there were a few in their 70s and 80s bow tie and wearing professors that we all called Dr. So-and-so,
Sure.
out of respect, but it was a first name basis. And I think that the professors there knew that any one of us who are their students could be the next Nobel Prize winner, right? There was a sense of creative collectivity and a huge amount of appreciation. It's interesting in the 80s. No, sorry. In 2000, I published a book on vaccinations. Naturally, as a home birth midwife, many of those families were confused about vaccinations or wanted an alternative approach. So I tried to create a book at that point, and still very much so. There was the non-vaccine camp that said if you vaccinate your children, it's going to die.
Right.
Autism wasn't really a word in the field at that time, but your kid is going to die. And the doctors all saying, if you don't vaccinate, your kid is going to die. And it really was that polarized. I mean, those were the words people were using. So I wanted to find some basis for common ground, again, that bridge building, right? Helping the totally hysterical physicians be able to talk to the moms and dads who were concerned, and the parents who were really confused find the place that they felt most safe and comfortable with. And a lot of my colleagues said, do not put on your resume or your medical school application that you wrote a book that questions vaccinations.
Right.
And I was like, well, I'm not going to go to a medical school that doesn't accept me for that.
Right.
I'm not going to hide that. They're going to find out. There is
Right.
Google. And it was very much appreciated, right? The curiosity for why I would do that. And so I felt like I could really be myself there.
Well, such an emotionally charged issue. It's we call it a landmine here. It's like something we don't really talk about. But
and then here I went down to admit a baby to the pediatric unit one day when I was a medical student. And it was a very affluent woman, educated, from a very wealthy part of Connecticut, who had 5 kids. The oldest 3 kids were vaccinated, but the 2 babies were born premature twins. And she was afraid to vaccinate the kids because of their immune vulnerability.
Yep.
She made what she considered to be a very reasonable and educated choice about vaccinations. And her baby was in the emergency department with a fever and high-pitched screaming and a lot of things that looked like they could have been meningitis. And so when you admit a baby when you're a medical student, you go up and you present the case to the team.
Right.
When I was in the emergency department, I said to the woman, I said, did you vaccinate your babies?
Right.
And she said, yes, I did. But I knew, I mean, I'd been a home birth midwife at this point. I knew from the way she answered me that she was kind of hedging. And I said, look, my name is Aviva Romm. I wrote a book on vaccinations. I just need to know if you did or you didn't, because if your baby has one of the infections that she could have gotten when we don't vaccinate, I just want to be able to help you the best I can. And she started crying and she said, no, I didn't. I was afraid to say so. But then when I went up to the to present the case, the pediatric department chief was there and he's freaking out. He's like, I'm going to report her to social services. I'm going to give her the right. Like, you know what?
So
I said, it's responses like that that keep people like her from bringing their kid to the doctor when they're sick. So just to be able to have that.
So where are you today on vaccinate? Like, without going into whole vaccine conversations, is it like a nuanced? Is it like,
it's very nuanced.
Yeah.
I mean, just to give you an example, I mean, I spent a month doing medical care in Haiti, and there were people there who were dying of tetanus and dying of diphtheria, things that we don't see here.
Even think about,
Right. So I think, we're very privileged in many ways to be able to completely choose to not vaccinate kids. It's very circumstantial. On the same token, there are a lot of things that we don't know about what
Right.
vaccinations are doing. So we've traded,
It's a lot of,
traded
right,
acute infectious disease for chronic disease.
right,
And do I think vaccinations have played a role in that? Absolutely.
right,
Is it because the vaccines themselves are toxic? Potentially, partly, but also it's just we're not getting the infections that tell the
right.
immune system what
And
to
then
do.
the little I know about the subject, there's schedule, there's frequency, there's,
69 vaccines.
right. It's all those,
It was like, 4
right,
vaccines and you were protected. Now
right,
it's 69 and it's
right. So,
so yeah. So
so yeah, no, I know that we'll come back for that. That's full. Yeah. A lot of people tuning in for that.
so med school was an incredible experience for me. And there were times where I had to speak up and say, you know what, I'm not comfortable doing that because I know that that's not needed and I don't need that for my training. There were other times where I had to do certain things to learn how to do them, which I wish I didn't have to do, but I also was
Right.
transparent with the parents about that. And there were times where other doctors were doing things that I wouldn't have chosen to do. And I took the attitude that if I were in your house because you invited me for dinner
Right.
and you were putting spices in your food that I thought were the wrong spices, I would
Right.
say to you, hey, Jason, those are the
Right.
wrong spices. It's your house. And I'm
So
respectful.
when you walk out of med school,
Mhm.
did you develop, I would say maybe the right word is like a respect for West, like an understanding, like for all the faults, and like how did that you walk out of med school, like reframe who you are
Yeah.
as in your core sense a healer, you know? Was there a respect? Was there just how did you start to think about who you were and how you practiced and Western and Eastern and taking the good and the bad from both
Yeah.
to change your perspective?
For me, medical training, you get, first of all, you go through a lot in 7 years and you see a
Sure.
lot and you do a lot and you're empowered to do a lot. So I think it was a very personally um, authorizing and validating experience that
Right.
also allowed me to have confidence to see that a lot of what I thought about Western medicine was actually pretty spot on, right?
Yep.
It's very much a band-aid oriented system that doesn't understand how we get sick very well, or if it does, it's from a very mechanistic
Sure.
perspective and that does not incorporate things that we really do know scientifically.
Treat symptoms, not causes. Right.
We think somebody's diabetes starts the minute they get the diagnosis, as opposed to
Right.
30 years of a standard American diet and
Right.
stress and the exposures that we're all experiencing. So I think for me, my perspective on medicine per se didn't change that much. It gave me a tremendous ability to say to people who were coming to me as patients from other practices, really, you don't need that medication, and we can actually do this instead. And that was hugely powerful.
Right.
And also, the times when somebody did need a medication, they also felt really confident that they were hearing it from someone who wasn't going to give that to them flippantly.
Right.
So that was a really beautiful thing for me. It gave me an enormous perspective on and an enormous respect for what doctors go through to
Mm-hmm.
become doctors. I mean, I finished medical school in 2009. I have a classmate who's becoming a pediatric neurosurgeon who started medical school with me when he was 24.
He's 60 now.
Still trained. He's got
Wow.
to go.
Wow.
I have a classmate, I just had dinner with her, tea with her recently, who is becoming a hand surgeon. So she's doing a very specialized hand surgery, which may sound very she, but if you think about how much you use your hands, if you have a hand trauma, you want someone who really knows
Right.
every muscle. And, she is still in training.
Right.
So, people give up a lot of their lives. It is a time where you lose a tremendous amount of autonomy. You said you were kind of like finding out how to get into a kegger when you were
Right.
16. I mean, these are people whose colleagues are making money and they're out in the world and they're having families and they're still in training in
Sure.
30s and early 40s. So you sacrifice a lot and you make a huge commitment. And there are just an enormous number of really good people who go into medicine for very altruistic reasons.
Right.
Unfortunately, what they don't know is there's another story.
Sure.
So they're really good people who are often learning one very limited story. And that's how I think of medicine, right? Like Western
Right.
medicine is one story. It's a sort of biomedical story.
Sure.
Herbal medicine is another story, right? Chinese
So-
medicine is another
So let me ask you this. So if we're talking about you in the sense of a bridge builder,
Yeah.
and let's say you're out having a drink with your friend who is super, doctor, very clinical, pro-Western, anti-Eastern, and then to your left, on your right, let's say you've got one of those on your right, someone you respect, you went to school with. On your left is an herbalist, midwife who has no respect for Western.
Yeah.
And you say like, okay, you two need to like, how do you bridge the gap with people on opposite ends of the spectrum?
For me, I think it's about conversation building. Right?
Yep.
And I think usually there's fear and misunderstanding. So this has happened to me many times where I have been at a book signing or a party or a medical conference, and there's polarization. And usually people will find like, wow, that's a really cool way of thinking about it, Aviva. And that's a really cool way of thinking about it. And they're both saying that. So I was actually at a party one time. It was a book signing I was invited to on a book about home birth.
Yep.
And the person who wrote the book is very rabidly kind of anti-medical. And there was someone invited to the party who was head of anesthesia in obstetrics at a very prominent Boston hospital. And at the end of the party, the head of anesthesia was asking for my business card, and we developed a very long rapport by email back and forth. And he said, wow, you're the first midwife I've ever met who I can understand what you're saying about why women have home birth. And at the same time, this other woman, she kind of understands some of why there are some things I take a little bit more of a conservative position on, but I've always been like that. That's not new as a doctor. So, that bridge building is really, I think, about finding the fear point, right? Like for obstetricians, for example, who are really anti-home birth, they've seen the worst case scenario because that's who they've seen come to the hospital. And they don't understand that sometimes that worst case scenario happened because a woman had a previously really abusive experience in the medical world and didn't want to go in that world again because it was traumatic for her. And there is a home birth community that may be illegal, or afraid to bring a woman into the hospital as a home birth midwife because she's afraid she's going to get arrested or something horrible is going to happen to her. So people stay home for a long time. So often what the OB in the hospital is seeing is sort of like the worst case scenario, because otherwise why would somebody be going to the hospital? So it creates a very fixed, narrow view of the medical model. And then that midwife is getting an OB who's at their worst because they're like, what the heck happened here?
I'm just seeing a mess. Yes.
Exactly. Like this is just a disaster. And so everybody's seeing the worst of each other instead of understanding the underlying values that are causing people to make the choices they're making and having respect. And again, it's like not having anything be like dichotomized or polarized, like recognizing this is all a spectrum of choice and helping people understand why this person is choosing that and dispelling fear.
So what is the future of medicine? Here we are, 2017. Like, what is your hope? Like, how have we progressed in, practices like integrative medicine, functional medicine? It seems like we've come quite a ways. Like, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Like, how do you see these worlds getting along? Like, what gets you excited about what you do?
I think there's tremendous light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, a big reason I left that sort of medical path when I was 15 to not become a doctor and to study the other things is because at that time, everything I saw in medicine was so limited. And there was no space for me. I mean, even the fact that I could go to medical school as this like very crunchy alternative, very radical and outspoken home birth midwife herbalist, I think says something about how medicine has actually shifted. I think there are tremendous shifts taking place. I think for one, a lot of doctors are, the depression and burnout rate amongst primary
crazy,
doctors is enormous.
Prescription drug medication.
I mean, the suicide rate amongst women doctors is one of the highest suicide rates in the country.
Jesus Christ.
It's pretty bad. And people are burnt out, they're unhappy, they're frustrated. The reasons they went into medicine are patient care, and what they're finding is endless paperwork and red tape and insurance issues. People aren't as happy with it. So I think many physicians are looking for another way that brings human connection back. It's satisfying. That's what.
Talk about the patient-doctor relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it's really gotten lost. It's just gotten powerfully lost. And it's because doctors are so pressured. When I was in a regular primary care clinic, the expectation was to see at least 25 patients a day. And so you're seeing people who
It's impossible. How do you do that and have a conversation?
Essentially, it gets down to checklists.
Right.
The way I got around it was
Pulse, heart,
coming for multiple visits.
right.
So, oh, your blood pressure's high. Okay, we'll come back in 2 weeks. Let's talk about that. Right. So in a way, you can game the system to get more time with your patients.
Right.
But yeah, there's a lot of burnout. There's a lot of dissatisfaction. So I think the system is being forced to change. Economically, the system isn't really changing. I mean, the system isn't really sustainable.
Right.
It's just not. And at the same time, you can improve patient communication. You can reduce overuse of antibiotics, but it's still not getting to understanding prevention.
Right.
And fundamentally, unfortunately, the system is still profit. It's very profit driven. It's very money driven, right? The pharmaceutical companies have a huge behind the
Right.
hand in what's happening in medicine. There's not a real connection between the food industry and the medical model. And I guess the real problem is it's still a medical industry.
Sure.
Right? There's no money in prevention.
Right.
The cartoon that says preventative medicine kills return business.
Sure.
So I think until doctors and until the medical model starts to see itself as a profession that should ultimately work itself out of it, it's not going to change.
So you mentioned preventative medicine. People listening, watching right now, what are just the few things everyone could do, simple things to just start living a healthier life?
The 3 things I would say are eat really well, like make your healthy eating your priority and be kind of
So what does that look like? Eat food, not too much, mostly plants, or
I mean, I think Michael Pollan really hit it on the head with that. I've got that written on my chalkboard.
Sure. We have that here too. Yeah.
It's a really powerful, simple tenet. And if your grandmother wouldn't have considered it food, it's probably not. And I think that sounds so facile and simplistic, but it's really quite powerful.
Yep.
I think the nuances of that are making sure that we're eating and not skipping food, especially in the health and wellness world. We can be very restrictive, very afraid of food. I think we have to reintroduce pleasure into healthy eating.
Orthorexia.
Exactly. I mean, I think orthorexia is just enormous in the health and wellness community. I see it a lot. And eating regularly, eating rhythmically, which kind of gets me to the next point, is we live in a very 24/7 kind of achievement-oriented culture.
Yep.
And I think we have to be willing to be dissidents about that a little bit and say, you know what? Yeah, this may be a 24/7 world, but this world doesn't have the right to take over my health.
Right.
And so really giving ourselves permission to hit the pause button on a regular basis, and however you want to think about
what does that look like for you?
For me, it looks like really listening to my body, right? I think we were kind of chatting about this earlier. I think we all know when we're going from stress to distress, but we override that, right? We just push a little further. We push a little further. We all know when we're pushing it for a deadline and we still feel okay. And then we all know when we're hitting whatever it is, the Red Bull or the Bulletproof, or whatever people are doing to kind of hack their need for sleep, hack their need for rhythm. And you can only do that so far. It's like a piece of elastic.
How much Bulletproof can you do?
Right. I think that not that human beings are elastic, but if you think about a piece of elastic, you can stretch it and it'll go back, and you can stretch it more and it'll go back. But if you stretch it too far, and it doesn't go back. And I think we're seeing a lot of the effects of people continually stretching it too far. I mean, and probably people who are watching or listening to us can get from our conversation. I mean, I'm very intense. I'm very high achieving. I write books and raise kids and run organizations and go to medical school all at the same time. But for me, the secret sauce is knowing to listen to my body and encouraging other people to say, what is that point where you're actually pushing past health?
Well, it's like the healthy side of stress versus unhealthy, right?
There's what's called eustress, stress, which is healthy stress. And then there's distress.
Right.
And distress is when you're starting to realize you're getting burnt out. You're not happy with what you're doing. You're unable, like the early signs, you can't focus. You feel like you're procrastinating. But really what you're doing is your brain is saying, I need a little break from this.
Right.
So before we get there, the real art is how do we craft a life and a daily rhythm that actually preempts the need for that, right? And if you're in your car, right, you take care of, most of us at least keep gas in our car, but you can only drive your car so far before it runs out of gas.
Right.
If your car hits the empty line, you start to get the signal, okay, I got to put gas in here. Maybe you're the person who likes to let your car get really low before you put gas because you're just that personality. But eventually, if you don't put gas in, you can't go anywhere. And so how can we start to think about our health and our bodies and our daily life and our rhythms as that empty line? And when you start to get to the empty line, you recognize the signs of it, right?
Right.
You're not sleeping. Maybe, you really want to catch it before you're not sleeping well.
Sure.
But those just daily signs, and they're different for everyone because I think all of us have, I call it a body barometer, like the little signals. For some people, it's a headache. For some people, they're not going to the bathroom. For some people, it's an old tooth thing that flares.
Right.
Whatever that is for you.
Right.
A little digestive symptom.
Sure. Everyone's got their weak spots. Yeah.
Exactly. So paying attention to like what your Achilles symptom is.
Yep.
And catching that really early and hitting the pause button.
Right.
That pause button can be 15 minutes of like, for me, it's putting on really loud music and dancing. It's like my boy band thing. I've got a whole boy band music. It's like the Clash. Yeah, the Clash, Los Psychos, the English Beat, Black Lips, and the Kinks.
I think your version of boy bands is a lot different than some of our listeners are probably going to say, like Justin Timberlake and sing Backstreet Boys.
So I put that on really loud, and it's just 15 minutes when I feel that coming on. It's knowing for me to get off my electronics about an hour before I go to bed.
Right.
Even though it's tempting to check that last
Right.
thing. I don't, I mean, occasionally I do. If I'm on a deadline, I do. And then giving ourselves bigger breaks, like a day, a week, if you can, without electronics. Just like, what does Sunday look like without going on your computer?
Right.
Or picking up your iPhone.
Right.
Once even. I think we forget it wasn't that long ago that we were doing that.
What's the last point?
The third thing is sleep, right? So it's sort of an extension, right? Food leads to rhythm and making sure that we're taking care of ourselves, and then sleep, getting enough sleep. And I think we believe that we can get along with 5 or 6 hours of sleep, but there's 10% or less of the population that can do that healthily for a while.
Right.
But actually, we need about 7 or 8 hours of sleep a night. And so making that sort of an uncompromising act of self-care.
Right.
I don't know if you know who Audre Lorde is. She was a very, prolific and prominent Black feminist writer. And she has a quote that says, self-care is not self-indulgence, and it's an act of political warfare.
Ooh.
To me, like, I'm not suggesting we engage in political warfare, but the world we're living in is our health is in battle with the world we're living in.
Right.
And what she was speaking of was taking care of herself as an African-American woman, being a right and a social rebellion. But I think all of us need to, ideally, would have a little bit of rebellion against a culture that's trying to take over our health. So honoring sleep, for me, it's getting into bed with a healthy rhythm. So for me, it's getting off of electronics and reading a real book, not my book, but I'm just using it as a real book.
This is a very good real book. Everyone should pick up. We'll talk about that.
Put you to sleep?
No. Well, they buy it. That's okay.
It's like, I'm getting in bed with your Coke and I'm reading it and I'm loving it. But, getting in bed with a real book, not a Kindle or an electronic version, and having a wind down. And then same thing in the morning, not just like my alarm's going off, I got to get out of bed, and that sort of overactivated stress response.
Alarm to bulletproof the subway.
Kids, right. Yeah.
So one last question before we talk about the book. So if you could go back in time to that young bullied girl, what would you say to her?
So interesting you asked this. I was just talking with my husband about this. Like, what would myself say now to myself then? And I think it would be really to not be so afraid of life, and to really trust myself, really trust my instincts. And, there's this quote by Einstein. He says, we have to decide at some point whether we live in a friendly or a hostile universe. And to really realize that even though there are moments in time that feel less than friendly, that getting into a mental space that allows me to see the universe as a friendly place, just kind of you start to look for what's going right in life.
Sure.
And you realize it all works out. So,
right.
Yeah, I think just to have a much more trusting, relaxed approach to life. And, to own my badass self. I mean, I think I said that to myself then, because there were times where I sort of,
It's a great title for a book.
yeah, I can get a book like that doing really well. But a bunch of years ago, I was trying to figure out what to call my business, which eventually had the very pedestrian title of Aviva Romm Enterprises, but I wanted to call it Bad Self Productions.
Oh, I like that.
Like that whole very 70s getting down with
Sure.
self. I think a lot of us lose trust in ourselves. We think that there are so many answers outside of ourselves that we need, rather than looking within, and we get very fearful. And I think I think owning our badassness is a good thing.
Amen to that. So we're going to move on to this amazing book that just came out for everyone watching or listening, The Adrenal Thyroid. It's a revolution.
Yes.
So why you're so knowledgeable, you've written lots of books. So like, why adrenal thyroid? Like, talk to me about the book quickly, and then why should everyone have to pick it up? We went through it here at Mind Body Green. We have lots of notes, like but I want to give it away. The book's unbelievable. So why the book?
Yeah. So the Adrenal Thyroid Revolution title is a little pedestrian. I fought for the word revolution in the cover. I kept wanting to call it.
I like it. We're in a revolution right now.
All right. I think medicine needs to change, and I think women need to be heard. And the book, even though everything in the book, from the plans and protocols and blueprint, work equally well for men, the reason I picked adrenal and thyroid are two things. One, I was just seeing this preponderance of women coming into my practice, young women in their 20s,
right,
having brain fog, cognitive issues, women in their 30s and 40s already being prescribed 2 and 3 medications for cholesterol and blood pressure. 1 in 4 women on antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications. And I was like, what is going on here? And in functional medicine and integrative medicine, the concept behind it is we look at the whole person,
sure,
just what's going on in the body and the labs and the diagnosis. And functional medicine provides an architecture to that. It provides a very specific set of things that we are looking at: the gut, mitochondria, which is energy production, detoxification and elimination, the immune system, right? There's a set of the gut. There's a set of root causes that we're looking at. And it's like, well, yeah, but what is sort of the mother of root causes that I'm hearing my patients saying? And woman after woman was coming in saying things like, Dr. Romm, or Aviva, or Dr. Aviva, they all call me different things, Dr. A, or saying things like, I feel like I'm stuck in the on position all the time.
Right.
I never turn it off. I feel like I'm stuck in survival mode. I kept hearing this as if it was written somewhere.
Right.
I'm stuck in survival mode, and I'm just like, living one day to the next. And I started actually looking at what did that mean, and what were the symptoms and the diseases I was seeing. And I went back to a book that I had read, I guess in the 80s or 90s, by Robert Sapolsky, called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
Huh.
And in that book, he talks about the stress response and the very
it's fight or flight, right,
physiologic things that happen in our bodies when that stress response is constantly overactivated. And it's things like poor sleep, high blood sugar, high cholesterol, autoimmune conditions, right? All the things that I was seeing. So I started taking a deeper dive into this world that he's part of called psychoneuroimmunology, which basically says that everything's connected, right? The immune system, the endocrine system, the nervous, there's literally no separation. Really, it's, all the separations we have are as literal as separations between countries. It's all one country.
Right.
And why are we seeing so many different diseases and conditions that are crossing over into so many different women from so many different backgrounds and lifestyles? So I started looking at what happens when our stress response system gets stuck in the on position, which is how this whole term got coined in the book, Survival Overdrive Syndrome. And that's where the adrenals come in. They're sort of the chemical delivery system at the end point of this stress response system. And the other thing is that women are experiencing autoimmune conditions in escalating amounts.
Yep.
And Hashimoto's is the one that most women are experiencing the most often. And 80 or more percent of all Hashimoto's affects women.
Right.
I was seeing women coming to me in incredible numbers with thyroid problems. And on top of that, these are conditions that women are most commonly medically dismissed for. Things like weight problems, depression, low energy. Well, it's just because you're tired. It's just because you're stressed, because you have little kids. So on average, it takes a woman, for example, with an autoimmune condition 5 years to get a proper diagnosis.
Sure.
During which time she's told it's
We spent thousands of dollars, multiple doctors.
Really struggling with keeping up with her life.
Well, sure. What you go through mentally when you go to doctor after doctor and they say like, you're crazy, in so many words, you're fine or you're crazy. You start to like mentally, that is really, really tough.
It really is. So the book is about all the ways that overwhelm is impacting our wellness, our
Right.
health. And it's not just stress, overwhelm the way we think about it. It's also the fact that we're exposed to 80,000 environmental chemicals.
Right.
And we don't even know what happens when those chemicals
Sure.
blending with each other. And that's overwhelming our detoxification systems. The 20 rounds of antibiotics that we get by the time we're 18, not to mention the other 10 we get by the time we're 30, and then on and on and on, overwhelming our gut's ability to withstand that insult. And it's really kind of back to what we were talking about earlier about that elastic ability to stretch, right? We have this, as human beings, we have this incredible capacity to heal. And that is something that the Western medical model does not acknowledge, right? If you get better, it's because you got the right medication or the right treatment, not because your body knew how to heal and we gave your body the tools it needed or we took away the things that were getting in the way. So the book is really about this intrinsic capacity that our body really does have to heal. But the fact that we're living in what I call, not a term that I coined, but from psychoneuroimmunology, an evolutionary mismatch. We haven't quite caught up with our ability to be resilient in the face of what's being expected of us, right? Our ancestors dealt with incredible challenges. But still went to bed mostly at a reasonable hour. Still ate meals together in community. Weren't quite so demanded on 24/7. Didn't have 80,000 environmental. This is all in the last year. Better living through chemistry, 60 years now. So the book is it's a non-romantic sort of scientific reason to return to some basic principles that actually remove the obstacles to our innate healing capacity and provide a lot of the basic things that we're missing because of our modern lifestyle that enhance your body's basic healing capacity. So how to use herbs and how to use supplements to actually support your elimination, your detoxification, and your sleep.
Well, the book is amazing.
Thank you.
Everyone pick it up, The Adrenal Thyroid Revolution. Thank you so much for being here. It is an honor and hope you'll come back again. I want to take a moment to invite you into our Mind Body Green ecosystem, where you can explore the infinite possibilities of health and well-being. All you have to do is click the subscribe button to hear more thought-provoking interviews with leaders in the health space. I am so grateful for all of you who have tuned in over the years, and let me tell you, it's only going to get better.